everybody, and welcome to Getting to Know Hue, the final chapter. In this video we are going to finish the entire assembly of the quilt. Now at the end of the last video there was a little bit of glitchy while I was filming that video, and the very final step of the corner block was missed or cut off before we finished the video. So the very final step on the corner block, we left it off where we had this as our corner block. So the final step is to take a 2.5 inch square of your background fabric, and we're just going to line it up right there on the dark side of the corner block, sew across, and then we will cut off that excess, and your corner block will look like this. So I guess that would be our first step, is to finish off that corner block, and then we'll go ahead and do the assembly on the Lone Star. There we go. So now our next step is to take those corner blocks and sew them on the ends of 2 of your zigzag borders. So grab 2 of your zigzag borders, sew a corner block on each end, and then we'll come back and apply the zigzag borders to the sides of our Lone Star. So there we are with our zigzag borders attached. Now the zigzag border should measure the same as your Lone Star block. If you find that the zigzag border is a little too big or too small, go back and check your 1/4 inch seam allowances, because there is a lot of seams in here, and make any adjustments that you need to if you don't quite match. So the next step, once you get your zigzag borders on, is to sew the 2-inch border of the background fabric that we have still got cut. So take a measurement of your quilt. Remember, when we're putting on a border, we want to measure the top, the middle, down at the bottom. Take those numbers, add them together, then divide by 3. That will give you the length to cut your borders. Now we will have to sew the fabric strips together to get borders long enough. So sew your fabric strips together, measure your quilt, cut them to the correct size, sew on your top, bottom, and the 2 side borders. They should be somewhere in the range of 56.5 to 57 inches. I happen to measure 57 inches on mine, so I'm going to cut my borders at 57. The side borders will be cut at probably 60, but I won't know that until I sew my borders on and then measure again to get my side borders. So back to the sewing machine. And here we are back from the sewing machine. I know it's really hard to see against my border here, or my design wall, but I do have the 2-inch border sewn on. So now we are ready to start assembling the blocks. So we're going to do the blocks in the order that it says on the book. So this is going to be my top corner. So I'm going to start with my blue. Actually, I need to put that quilt down just a little bit because I can't reach. So let's just lower this down a little so I can reach. Where's all those other pins? There we go. That's better. Now I can reach. So we're going to start with the blue, and the blue is going to go in this corner. So there is a blue on every corner of the quilt. Next we want to go to orange, then green, purple, gold, and another blue. Okay, so you're going to lay out all the rest of the blocks. So going down in this direction, we're going to do a red, yellow, green, magenta, turquoise blue, and another regular blue. On the opposite side over here, we're going to start with the turquoise blue, Then we are going to do magenta, yellow, green, red, and finally blue. And then across the bottom, going from, well, right to left, it's going to be, of course, the blue in the corner, gold, green, purple, orange. So same as across the top border. So now what you're going to do is you're going to sew, starting with the orange, you'll sew all of these together right here. Your side borders will start with the blue and end with the blue, and your bottom border is going to be the same across the bottom. So go ahead and sew all those blocks together, and they should match up with the size of your white border. If that's not the case, once you get your blocks together, if you need to make adjustments, you can make adjustments in your seam allowance. So that's our next step. Back to the sewing machine. And here we are, back from the sewing machine again. So I have all my pieced borders on. Oh, got a stray thread there. All my pieced borders on. So the only thing left for us to do is to put the final border on the quilt. Now in the book, it talks about cutting your border on length of fabric, and that means cutting it parallel to the selvage. And a lot of times designers will do that for the final border, because if you cut on length of fabric, there is no stretch to the fabric. Where if you cut width of fabric, there's a little bit of stretch. So it doesn't really matter at this point whether you cut length of fabric or width of fabric, because either way you're going to have to be piecing those borders together. There's about a meter and 3/4 of fabric left, roughly at this point. So either way, we're going to have to piece those borders. But what you're going to need to do is to cut, in the book they're cut 7-inch borders for the top and the bottom, and 4-inch borders for the sides. Here's where you have a little bit of leeway, and you can do your own thing depending on how big you want your quilt to be. You can cut your borders all the same size if you have enough fabric to do so, or you can cut them exactly as they are in the book. So I have done the math for my personal quilt, and if I cut my borders at 6 inches, I will have enough to do a 6-inch border all the way around the quilt instead of a 7 on the top and 4 inches on the sides. But you can do whatever it is you want to do. And the way to figure out how much border you will need is to, first of all, measure your quilt. And the quilt should measure in somewhere around about 89 inches wide. Well, actually square at this point, somewhere in around 89 inches. So take your personal measurement. You're going to have to do it anyway, because we always do that when we put borders on. Take your personal measurement and figure out how wide you want your border to be. So for an example, let's just say I want my border to be 6 inches. I'm going to measure the top and the bottom of my quilt, and they're 89 inches. If I add a 6-inch border to the top and a 6-inch border to the bottom, that will give me 101 inches. Give or take seam allowance. That's generous because there's no seam allowance taken off of that. So I then take 101 inches and add that to the two sides, because that's how long my side borders would be. Because you've got your 89 inches plus your 6 inches plus your 6 inches. So that would make them 101 inches long. So that gives me 380 inches of length that I need. Now, if you take that and divide that by 40, which is the usable length of your strips, that would mean you have to have 9.5, and we don't do half strips, so 10 strips cut at 6 inches each. And that would give you a 6-inch border all the way around. Now, if you have enough fabric to do that, cutting them at 6 inches, then feel free to do so. If not, cut for whatever size border you have fabric left of. Now, if you're cutting length of fabric, you need to measure how much fabric you have left. And again, we will use that as your usable width of fabric. So let's just assume that you have 1.5 meters left, and that's roughly about 60 inches. So you would take your measurements again, and we came up with 380 inches of border that we need. Divide that by the 60 inch, which is the usable length of your fabric. And that means that you need to be able to cut 6 and a little bit. Well, we don't cut 6 and a little bit strips. We would need to round up to the next strip, which means we need to cut 7 strips. And that equals 42 inches. So if you are really super careful, you could possibly get that number of borders out of length of fabric, because you need 7 strips, and if you're cutting a 6-inch wide border, that's 42. But if you cut your borders down to say 5.5, you'll have plenty of fabric to do that without any issues. So depending on what you want to do for your quilt will be what you'll cut your final borders. So remember, when you're putting your borders on, measure the top, the middle, the bottom edge of your quilt. Take that number, divide it by 3. That will be the number you're going to cut your borders to. So cut to that number, put your borders on, piecing center to center, doing any easing that needs to be done. Then what you will do is you are going to then measure this side down the center and that will tell you the length of your other borders that you need to have. Cut them to that size and apply them. And that is almost done. The only other thing we need to worry about is the flange border, if you want to put in a flange border. I talked a little bit about that in the last video on applying the flange border, but it's something you can't apply until you are ready to do your binding. And of course the binding can't be done until the quilting is all finished. So we actually won't be putting that little piece on for quite a while, or I won't be putting it on for quite a while because I don't have the quilting done on my quilt yet. When that time comes, I will do another small little video on putting on the flange border. So that is going to be it for this quilt for now. So it has been an absolutely wonderful year. I have enjoyed it immensely. I hope you have too. And thank you very much for tuning in. Bye for now. Happy quilting. Hey everybody. Hope you're all doing really well. This is just a small amendment to the final video. One of our, well, several of you had decided that you wanted to make a king size quilt instead of the queen size quilt. And Carol, who did a beautiful job, has shared a picture and some of the math that needed to be done. So just one second here, and I'm going to share my screen. And so we can see Carol's quilt. There we are. Okay, so this is the king size version of our Getting to Know Hue. And when we were doing some of the designing in the beginning, we thought it might be the best looking idea to add another one of these zigzag borders around the outside and then add the regular borders around that. So Carol very graciously has finished her quilt and it is absolutely gorgeous, but also she shared some of the math. So for some of you that are doing the king size, this is what you need to do. The quilt, in Carol's case, finished 88.5 inches before any of the zigzag border was put on. And then she did another 22 sets of zigzags for each side. So that would be in here, there's another 22 sets of zigzags. So that would be a total of 88 zigzag pairs. And then of course, just 4 more corners. And then on top of that, she added a 3-inch border all the way around the outside, and it gave her quilt a 100-inch square. So beautiful job, Carol. That looks absolutely lovely. And for those of you who are doing the king size, that's what you need to be looking at finishing off. So let me just stop sharing my screen now. So I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I am. There will be, again, one more video that I will put out once I get my quilt quilted, that I will go over putting the flange border on. So it's not quite done yet. So bye for now. Happy sewing.